Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be calling the July 17, 2013 Eugene City Council work session to order. I will be running the meeting today because the mayor, as part of her duties, is the chair of the Lane Area Transportation Committee, and she's been asked to give a presentation to the Oregon Transportation Committee on STIP process and transportation issues and goals for our region, so she is not available. And Councilor Evans won't be here today. He is teaching a special class today, so he won't be available. And Councilor Zelinka will be joining us by phone. And today's first topic is a work session on safe demolition.
Thank you, George. I'll just turn over to Stuart.
Well, good afternoon, City Council. I'm Stuart Ramsing with the Planning and Development Department. And,
Stuart, if you could get us real close to that microphone and speak up, please.
Yeah, so I'll give a background for your discussion here. We'll try to keep it, it's kind of a dry topic. It's dry as demolition debris, but without the health hazards. So the work session poll on the topic initially listed a discussion of protocols governing safe demolition, independent hazardous materials testing and monitoring, and sharing of information with stakeholders. But additionally, Councilor Brown provided questions and more background for your information. Response to a number of the questions are woven into the information I'll share to inform your discussion. Many of the issues this topic raises could fill a whole entire work session on their own. So we'll wait to see where your discussion leads us for our next steps here. Underlying the topic, however, of safe demolition is the concern of lead and asbestos and the potential that may of their release as part of the demolition process. Lead has long been recognized as a harmful environmental pollutant. This is nothing new. Back in the 90s, even the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services called lead the #1 environmental threat to the health of children in the United States. There are a number of sources of lead in the built environment, but the primary concern during demolition is that lead that's released from the lead-based paints. Lead was a major constituent of paints up until 1978 when that was banned. Asbestos is a mineral fiber. It occurs in rock and soil naturally, and it's mined. And because of its strength and heat resistance, it's used also in a number of construction, was used in construction materials. The abatement, however, of asbestos is, unlike lead, is strictly regulated. It should be removed from buildings before the demolition process actually occurs, and but so thereby eliminating the risk of the asbestos. There's one other important piece of background regarding lead safety related to renovation, and that is since 2010 or 11, there's some significant new rules for handling of lead when it deals with renovation. However, those rules exempt demolition. Demolition in this context is the entire removal of a building from a site. So one does hear at times about the renovation rules and lead-based paint. It does not apply to demolition process. So I'm going to share some of the context, and it may be plainly obvious context in which demolition occurs, but ultimately an owner may have the liability for the impacts caused by the demolition of their building. There won't be any agreement on how meaningful this impact is, but it does tend to eliminate the extremes of an owner, for example, pushing a building onto an adjacent property with a right-of-way for others to clean up. And it also deters owners from flagrant disregard to some of the rules that exist. Insurance and bonding, that industry is always routinely raising the standards for industries they insure as conditions of their coverage. The contractors that deal in demolition are dependent on coverage from insurance and bonding in Oregon, and it's also often a condition of the contract in that they pursue to do their work. Industry best practices. Generally, the demolition contractors incorporate these practices, these best practices, and they're an effective shield from additional regulatory scrutiny. Trade associations consolidate and share with their members the regulations and demonstration practices that allow them to be successful and stay current with the advances in their industry. The National Demolition Association, for example, monitors continually the status of relevant regulations for their industry, ranging from OSHA regulations to recycling protocols. The rules and regulation development related to hazardous materials is part of the work that industry association monitors, and they pass along that to the member contractors. And then Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, primarily concerned with the workplace safety regulation. However, a workplace that is safe is a good start to a safe environment beyond the workplace. And then closer to home, we have the City of Eugene, and Eugene has basic protections for site erosion, pedestrian safety, disconnection of utilities, make sure that's done properly, and we ensure that property is safe when the demolition is finished. The demolition permit in Eugene costs from a little over $100 to several $100, depending on what needs to be inspected. There's plumbing and electrical work. Erosion work is variable depending on the size of the disturbance. But Eugene's authority generally does not address lead or asbestos that may be disturbed during demolition, which leads me to the next bullet, and that's Lane Regional Air Protection Agency, or LRAPA. LRAPA has the authority for virtually all aspects of the Federal Clean Air Act, not the DEQ or EPA in Lane County. In Lane County, it is our local air protection agency, LRAPA, that has that authority and oversight. LRAPA is an autonomous governmental agency. It's a special purpose in municipal government authorized by state law. They perform their work under agreement with the EPA. And as part of that agreement, they must adopt the clean air regulations and have staff that are capable of administering those. Their office here is in Springfield, and they have oversight over the entire county, Lane County. So LRAPA takes the regulatory lead on asbestos, and for all demolitions, an asbestos survey is required, except for the exemptions would be for 4 or fewer dwellings. That would include single-family dwellings. And the survey is performed by accredited inspectors only. That's going to assure a qualified, knowledgeable individuals doing the survey. All building components are evaluated, samples are taken, they're tested in laboratories for their asbestos content, if any. Following the survey, a report is created, and that report needs to be maintained on site during any demolition work. That report is not necessarily a public document, but it needs to be on site, and so LRAPA inspectors have access to that, so does the contractor doing the work. If it's helpful, I can go through the asbestos abatement process to you. It's very regulated, very prescriptive, and there is testing as follow-up before any of the containment and before the demolition of the structure can occur. Now let me explain a little bit LRAPA's role relating to dust. They refer to it as fugitive emissions, and what that means is emissions which could not reasonably pass through a stack, a chimney, or a vent. In other words, it's dust. Dust is a fugitive emission, regardless of what it may contain, what may be contained within that dust. And dust and all fugitive emissions are regulated by LRAPA's Title 48, and those regulations specify that one must take reasonable precautions to prevent particulate matter from becoming airborne. The reasonable precautions shall include the use, where possible, of water or chemicals for control of dust in the demolition of existing buildings or structures. So these regulations make it necessary for a contractor to manage demolition actively to prevent that airborne dust. It's an outcome based with an exception of the required use of water. The contractors have a range of methods available to them, and they've got that flexibility as long as they prevent the dust from becoming airborne. So as you might imagine, the industry practice is aligned with the regulatory protocols here. The asbestos survey occurs from they hire an accredited firm. The site is secured, usually using, you see a number of variations, temporary cyclone fencing. Asbestos is, if it exists, is removed from the building. It's abated prior to the demolition of the building. Tests of the abated areas generally occur before the demolition occurs to make sure the asbestos, there's no lingering asbestos. Contractors can consult with LRAPA inspectors if they have questions about dust control. LRAPA has an important relationship with the local demolition contractors. running afoul of the regulatory process slows a job and is potentially expensive, so the contractors and LRAPA inspectors have regular contact and relationship. Stormwater protections may involve filtering catch basins, erosion fencing, sediment controls. And then during the actual work, water spray is routinely used to suppress the dust when it's required. But what's more important than the number of fire hoses used is the pace of demolition must not exceed the rate at which the water can wet the demolition and suppress the dust or prevent the dust from becoming airborne. So as well, some cases water trucks are used to bring water onto the site and spray it. So as part of this preparation and presentation, we did some research of other communities and their protocols. I won't touch on asbestos because in all the cases, the asbestos standards are very routine across the nation. The other regulations around lead specifically are variable, and I'll touch on them briefly. So we looked at the city of Seattle. Seattle requires permits. They have a waste diversion plan required. They have environmental review for sensitive areas, but they're looking here at riparian shorelines, wetlands, areas of steep slopes. They don't specify anything specific related to lead-based paints or those type of environmental hazards. They have a pre-demo inspection and a pre-construction meeting with erosion control being the primary emphasis. They had to provide a final inspection. And they didn't specify that they deal with dust control, but I believe similar to LRAPA's role here in Lane County, they deal with either the state or their county in the dust control. Looking at the city of San Francisco, permits are also required. Erosion control is required. Mailed notice to owners of properties at least 300 feet from the demolition. They require notice there, and as well notice to the adjacent tenants. The notice must include only three things: the street address, the owner name, and the contractor contact information. For larger sites, larger than half an acre, dust control plan may be necessary in San Francisco. And the measures that may be included in a conforming dust control plan include a number of things. Really quick, wetting dry soil, stabilizing soil, limiting the area of soil excavated, limiting the amount of storage of soil, stopping excavation if there's high wind, and they define that as 25 miles an hour in San Francisco, using dust curtains covering piles and washing trucks, limiting speeds on the construction site, sweeping streets. A couple you might be interested in, they do require placing dust monitors upwind and downwind of particular dust and keeping records of monitored data, and establishing a public complaint hotline. I share the detail in this case because it appears that in the dust control plan what they're looking at is eliminating dust from the excavation in the soil. There is no mention of lead-based paint or the asbestos process or asbestos abatement in that. Let me move on to some of the other cities we looked at. Boulder, Colorado. They require permits, and I found very little in the way of specifics on their permitting website, except that they do defer to the state of Colorado Air Pollution Control Division as a condition of the demolition permitting. Cincinnati, Ohio. They require permits, erosion control as well, and they do have a dust control. It's required, and the requirement states as not to cause any adverse effects to adjacent properties or tenants. And they go on to say that this may be achieved by using water. This will be a minimum of a 1.5-inch fire hose with adequate pressure to eliminate dust during demolition operations. Baltimore, a city cited regularly as an example for safe demolition protocols. An interesting fact from the website is their office is responsible for and oversees over 300 unsafe structures demolished annually, a significantly different scale than the city of Eugene. But they also had recently an 88-acre project. It was called the East Baltimore Revitalization Initiative, where in 2006 alone they demolished over 500 homes. I can go into more detail if desired about that project, but they developed some protocols as part of that, having virtually none on the books prior to that. But back to specifically what their code requires now, they have permits, they have erosion control. They also have a notice. Their notice must indicate the date of work, contractor name, and the contractor's emergency contact. Additionally, they require a sign on the property between 5 and 10 days before the demolition occurs. All the contractors there are licensed by the City of Baltimore. They have a sign-off by Maryland Department of Environment, on-site meeting with the inspector, and a pest control certificate. The only city that requires that, other ones we looked at. Closer to home in Oregon, we looked at the city of Portland. They have erosion control and building permits necessary. They make lead informational pamphlets available as part of their demolition permit. They defer to the Oregon Health Authority for lead-based paint related to the demolition, and they defer to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality for any asbestos issues related to demolition. I don't believe they have a regional air protection agency as we do with LARAPA here in Lane County, so they deal with Oregon DEQ. The other end of the state, Ashland, they require permits, erosion control, and they do have a demolition committee review, but their concern is trying to preserve historic structures, and it's not related to the hazards that may result from demolition. And I found no mention of dust control in their permitting process. And then very close to home, right across the river, the city of Springfield, permits are required, erosion control, of course. Verification that asbestos was properly removed is necessary, and they defer to LARAPA, as Eugene does, to the dust and asbestos regulations. So in all cases, some kind of permitting is necessary. Asbestos appears to be dealt with uniformly. I believe all have some type of erosion measures. Notice and posting of properties required in several communities, but without information on health concerns or the mention of lead-based paint. Notice is not required currently in the city of Eugene. Dust control plans are required with varying degrees of specifics. San Francisco's has the most detail and seems to be related to controlling dust coming from the excavation and traffic on the site. So although lead seems universally acknowledged as a harmful pollutant, extremely toxic to children, there appear few, if any, regulations specifically addressing lead abatement as part of the demolition, at least at the cities we researched. That said, there's some evidence that the control of fugitive emissions may adequately prevent the airborne spread of lead-based paint dust. In other words, significantly limiting that spread of the dust of fugitive emissions may be occurring, or while it's occurring in Eugene area in any case, and that controls the spread of lead-based paint that may be part of the demolition debris or in the dust from demolition. So let me bring this now to a close here with a recommendation, and unless this work session discussion takes us elsewhere, that we believe one reasonable next step is for Eugene staff to meet with staff from LARAPA and from Lane County Health and Human Services to identify if a regulatory hole does exist whereby lead-based paint is currently or may become an unregulated pollution source or health risk in the community. If a regulatory void does exist, we can bring back options for Council's consideration in the fall. And with that, I'll turn it over to your discussion.
Okay. George?
Thank you, Council President. Thanks for the presentation, Stuart. Well, I brought this forward because there is a serious regulatory gap concerning lead dust that can be produced in pre-1978 buildings when they come down. 1978 was when all paints were lead-free. And so any building constructed pre-1978 is suspicious. Lead paint was developed before that, but it became totally outlawed in 1978. The EPA does have very strict guidelines for demolition and lead abatement, lead in any form, but it only applies to dwellings, to houses and child-occupied facilities. That would be a school or a preschool or something like that. It does not, the regulations do not apply to public buildings or commercial buildings. There are currently, the EPA is currently revising, they're working on that aspect, but things move slowly in Washington, and no final ruling is expected for at least 2 more years, and probably longer, the way things go. So there is a gap in a regulatory gap concerning proper abatement of lead in commercial and public buildings. And so, you know, I went through your list that you provided of other cities, and Well, first of all, I started with our code, hazardous substance discharge and removal. There's no mention of lead at all. And asbestos is not the primary concern, the reason for the work session request, because LRAPA does. That's already, covered by LRAPA. It's more like lead and particulate matter, PM, in other words. For those of you who went through the CD that I've supplied a couple months ago, you may be wondering why the World Health Organization, this huge document, was included, and maybe scrolled through the table of contents and couldn't find anything regarding lead. That's true, there wasn't anything regarding lead. It was the World Health Organization report on hazardous materials. However, I included that because they had a lengthy section on particulate matter, which is also very damaging to human health. Causes bronchitis, all kinds of respiratory problems, very serious. They can lead to death in certain individuals. So that's the reason I included that. I have a feeling if we take care of lead, and the main danger from a demolition is inhalation of lead dust, that if we can take care of the lead dust, that will also take care of the particulate matters and remove that from being a health concern. So that's why I put that in there.
George, let me check with other folks first.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry.
Alan, do you want in the queue? Alan? Yes, not. Anybody?
Sorry, I had you on mute. No, I don't have anything at this time.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, George?
Thank you. I think just briefly I'll mention why this is a concern. I mean, perhaps we're all aware, but I'd just like to get it out publicly. I mean, the dangers, especially to young children, and that includes fetuses and the pregnant woman, because lead is delivered via the placenta to the fetus. Even in tiny amounts, researchers have found, and there's absolutely no question, this is accepted by health officials and doctors all over the world. There's been enough research. Is incredibly dangerous, even in tiny amounts, 5 micrograms per deciliter or per cubic meter of air. It can cause convulsions, coma, and death. It permanently damages a child's neurological functions, basically leads to what you could call commonly mental retardation. There's no abatement, there's no, I mean, it's permanent. Once it happens, that child is damaged for life. You can't clean it out. It causes, it can cause, early birth in a fetus. It can cause actually behavioral problems later in life for children that have been poisoned by lead. So that's the reason for the concern. And so I look at our code, hazardous substance discharge and removal. There's no mention of lead. And we're referred to, they just mainly mention petroleum byproducts, safe disposal of petroleum byproducts, which is very important too, of course. But then we're referred to the Federal Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So if you go there, which I did, you backtrack on the websites, and you find that there's no mention of lead in that document. And they refer you to another document, which is the Clean Water Act, and there's no mention of lead there. So there is a gap, and in looking at Cincinnati and East Baltimore, those are the two best. I would highly recommend. I mean, this wasn't in the packet, but since the city of Cincinnati, and one of the main leads on this was Rashmi Aparaji, which is the Cincinnati Health Department. They did a health impact assessment of the demolition of a lead-painted bridge adjacent to a residential area. Why? Well, it's a steel bridge, but it's many years of coatings of lead-based paint in a neighborhood with schools and residences, and this is an excellent protocol, and that's what they followed for the demolition of that bridge. But I couldn't find any incorporation of these principles and protocols in the city code. Same thing with the East Baltimore.
George,
Oh, sorry.
Betty,
Okay, my question is, could we ask Merlin Huff to come to the table? I see he's in the audience from LRAPA. I'm interested in what role LRAPA might play in this. And I know we have sometimes had experts from outside the council come to the table.
Well, before we do that, can I ask you a quick question, Stuart? Did you say that you, following this work session, that you were going to meet with LRAPA and go over the question of lead, and if there was a gap, you're going to come back and propose a change? Did I misunderstand that?
Unless as a result of this work session, the council chooses to take us in a different direction, I would propose that as a reasonable next step.
And Betty,
Since Merlin's here, I thought we might ask him what he thinks LRAPA's role might be in this.
well, I think we may be getting a little bit too far ahead, because I don't think anybody at this table doubts that there is, some dangers involving lead.
I know that, but I mean what LRAPA might do about it.
Well, without discussing it with Stuart, I don't know if there's...
I can speak generally to what LRAPA's role is here. I won't try to represent their organization, but LRAPA is the entity in this charged with the fugitive emissions, what they refer to it, and it's dust. It's the particulate matter that you speak to, and that needs to be limited. And water is the only requirement in their code. It's outcome based, and so the contractors do use a number of methods to eliminate the dust. They have inspectors that proactively follow up on this, and then they respond to complaints as well. So LRAPA is the agency that's charged with that responsibility to make sure those fugitive emissions do not leave the site.
Does that answer your question?
No. I would like to ask Merlin, what do we need to do to have LRAPA take a greater role?
Okay. If he wants to.
Since he's right here,
Have we determined they need to?
what?
I wasn't aware we determined that.
That's what I said. I think
It is. Thank you. I'm Merlin Huff, Director of Maine Regional Air Protection Agency. And just first let me say that I believe staff does an excellent job of reviewing programs in other cities, and I think what staff has recommended as the next step is very reasonable. If you choose to take further steps on this particular issue. As far as fugitive dust control, yes, LRAPA is responsible for that. Lead in particular, though, is a specialty thing that EPA is responsible for, and that's why the comments about what EPA might do in the future and what time frame it might take them to do anything further than they've already done. So that is a specialty area, and I think that would be one thing I would suggest if the council takes staff recommendation on next steps, would be perhaps to connect even somebody from EPA Seattle office in that conversation. But we also are in contact with other local air agencies, some cities beyond those that are on that the staff looked at here. Dayton, Ohio, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We've had contacts with them as well, but in those particular cities, their approach is very, very similar to what LRAPA does, is focuses on control of dust rather than any specific lead requirements.
Then LRAPA would not have a greater role if we should take some sort of action.
Well, if you take the staff recommendation, LRAPA would be involved with that conversation, and depending on what comes out of that conversation would determine whether there's a greater role requested of LRAPA.
But you could do something about it if directed to. Is that right?
Well, that would be for the LRAPA board, really, to provide direction on that.
I know about the board. I used to be on it.
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Got it?
Yes, thanks.
Mike?
Thank you, sir, very much. I appreciate George bringing this to our attention. I know during the process of some of the construction downtown earlier, there was a good deal of conversation around this issue and the dust and videos and so forth that were taken about a particular project. But I also remember the input from the company doing the demolition. And while I certainly agree that our job is to create the appropriate regulatory environment for the sake of safety, I want to make sure that before we go piling on new regulations that we have a genuine hole or gap, and I'm not sure that's been demonstrated to my satisfaction yet, that we're not controlling dust enough. I'd also, before we get to a point where we're adopting any direction to staff, would probably want to hear from some of the companies that do that work in our community, because I can think of at least one or two that the people that run those companies are very good folks and very knowledgeable about their industry. And I think it wise for us to get the best information on the most current practices and how we might easily create good regulation and appropriate regulation that works. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you. I too appreciate George bringing this issue up. If there is an issue, if there is a need around the notion of fugitive particles or asbestos or lead or whatever, we need to be aware of it and we need to address it. For me, the most important thing is to be thoughtful and appropriate in what that response should be. There are agencies, there are organizations, committees, and staff that are already in place to deal with this. If there are gaps, then I think those are the most appropriate people to identify and work on solutions within those gaps. So I think your recommendation that you not just say, that was a nice work session, let's all go home and continue business as usual, is not what to do. I think your recommendation to say, let's get together with LRAPA, let's get together with the folks that have jurisdiction over these topics and look and identify the gaps and then make recommendations for the next steps and best practices is a very appropriate one. The safety of our community is one of our primary responsibilities as a city council. We must do everything within our power to ensure the safety of the people within our community. And if there is a lack or a gap, we need to address it, absolutely. I just want to make sure that it's done by the people who have the expertise, the skill, and are already in place to be able to do that. That is you, that's the folks at LRAPA, that's whoever you believe from the EPA or other groups need to be engaged in that. And so I fully support the notion that we leave from this work session with a clear direction for you to keep that ball rolling and identify for us if there are gaps and if there are, what steps we need to make or take to close those gaps. And for me, the most important thing is to let's go down the path of the folks that are already in place and already have the systems and can take care of this problem if it does indeed exist. And I appreciate the comments from LRAPA because they are the agency that we have assigned to protect us and help us with that. And they should absolutely be involved along with the EPA, the county to the degree necessary, but also city staff who are indeed doing a good job. So, yeah, let's not just leave it rest. Let's go on that next step. I agree.
Claire?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with Councilor Pryor. I think it's a good next step to have that conversation to see if there are gaps. So this might seem like a silly question, but presumably there is an easy way to test if there is lead paint in a building. Is that correct?
Yes, there are ways to test if there's lead paint within a building, but if the building was constructed prior to 1978, usually the presumption is that lead-based paint it does exist,
Okay.
and so testing is not necessarily the presumption is that it's in there.
Gotcha. And you talked about some of the protocols of other cities, but didn't necessarily compare them directly to ours. Do we have any requirement of notice for demolition?
We have currently no requirement of notice.
And if you mentioned San Francisco, which sounds like they have some pretty strict protocols, has these on-site monitoring systems. Do they provide those? Do you know if they provide those to the construction contractors, or are those something the contractors have to provide?
That part was not clear, but there was also a requirement they set up a hotline. gave the impression that this is all the responsibility of the contractor. And with that as well was not any clarity about what the measures to monitor, but not to what standards are they monitored. That was unclear. Not that they don't have more, we could go pretty deep into that topic, and their health department regulates that. So.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to do that right now. I was just curious. And then on the fugitive emissions, so under asbestos abatement, if it's 4 or fewer dwelling units, it's exempt from the asbestos demolition standards. Is that true for fugitive emissions as well?
Let me clarify. It's exempt from the need for the survey.
Oh.
If there is asbestos, it'd still be expected that that be dealt with appropriately.
Okay. That's not necessarily clear from the slide.
No, I apologize for that.
That's okay.
But I do not believe there is such an exemption for a similar exemption for fugitive emissions. I'd have to confirm that with LARAPA. That if LARAPA were to, I believe the case to be if LARAPA were to receive a complaint about dust coming from a residential demolition, that LARAPA would respond.
And Merlin's shaking his head yes. So, I do support the idea of staff meeting with LRAPA and Health and Human Services to see, if you can identify any gaps in what we're doing. But, I do wonder if it makes sense, even recognizing the terrible harm that lead itself does, if it makes sense to call that out as a particular item that we're trying to get at. If we're really getting at the fugitive dust as a whole is going to get to the result that we're looking for. So kind of along the lines of what Mike was saying about not trying to create whole new regulations if we're actually getting at the problem that we're trying to get at, and maybe there's just some small things that need to be tightened up to do that. But maybe there's a particular reason why we'd want to call lead out, but there could be other harmful substances that is mixed in there that we would also want to, would we want to have a whole list of things, or would we just want to get at controlling the emissions overall? So that's just some thoughts on that. So thank you.
George?
Thank you. Well, I put a potential motion in front of everyone. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get an email to everybody yesterday.
This?
Yes. It kind of covers the concerns that I've heard around the table. Well, first, I'll maybe read this in the next round, but I just have a few more comments. There are indeed gaps. There are tremendous gaps in the current situation here with our code and our requirements. And you're correct. If we can take it, but lead must be addressed. It's to leave it out of the language in these regulations is it would be improper in my view. And if lead dust can be contained properly and safely, and protect the public health, and then particulate matter will, be taken care of simultaneously. I wanted to continue the two best models that I've seen. I'll just repeat: are Cincinnati and the demolition of this bridge. But these didn't make it into city code. And then East Baltimore, in spite of reading, this is from HUD, the HUD site about the East Baltimore project. The East Baltimore development project demolition protocol proved to be so effective and associated costs so minimal that in 2007 the city of Baltimore revised its building code so that safety measures from the East Baltimore development protocol are now citywide standard. I looked at their building code and couldn't find it. So it may, perhaps it's a different place in the code, but and I think those would be a very useful guide for, for the conversations. They're the most complete. They were based on tons of health studies and found to be very effective in containing the nearby contamination of neighborhoods and streets. And see, it's even dangerous to walk on this stuff and then walk home because you're bringing it into your home then. And if you have small children, it's just almost a guarantee of future health problems. So I don't know if I have enough time to, I think I have enough time to read my motion.
If you're putting the motion out, go ahead. We'll let you finish reading the motion.
Great, thank you. I move to direct the city manager to propose for council approval 8 to 12 Eugene residents who are not employed by a public agency to serve as an independent advisory group to the council regarding the potential lead poisoning risks from demolition of commercial and public buildings. The members of the group shall represent diverse interests and perspectives, and no more than 2 members shall be employed by or have a financial interest in demolition or construction businesses. At least 1 member shall be from the medical profession, preferably with knowledge and experience related to lead poisoning. The group shall elect a chair who will represent the group before council. The city manager's office shall provide administrative support to the advisory group. The advisory group shall research the issues and call upon local and non-local agency staff and independent experts for advice and review. The advisory group shall submit a report to council by January 1st. I think that's unrealistic, maybe January 15th. The report shall include descriptions and assessments of the risk of public exposure to lead from demolition, contemporary best practices to prevent public exposure to lead from demolition, and recommendations for actions the city can take to protect the public from lead poisoning as a result of demolitions. I'll speak to it if I get a second.
I'll second for purposes of discussion.
Thanks. Well, I think this answers some concerns that some of the other councilors had. Councilor Clark was concerned that we ought to hear from people in the demo and construction business. I agree, 100%. That takes that into account. We hear from health professionals. City staff is involved because the support will come from staff. And then the committee can ask for testimony from public health officials, people from the EPA, people from the DEQ in Salem. I mean, I think it really covers a lot of the concerns. They can review best practices, dig deeper into other cities' codes. I've done a lot. I've spent many hours on this, and a lot of those were dead ends. There are gaps all over the country. Cincinnati and Baltimore have the best protocols. I think would be a basis for further research. So, and then, you know, this group would go in and with no preconceptions study the problem and bring and consult people from all the agencies and expert witnesses, knowledgeable people, and then come back to council with the recommendations. And by this time, since staff's participating, they might have some ideas about changing or, you know, some code changes. So I think this is maybe the way to go here. I'll speak to it again after I hear from everyone else. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you. I still am waiting to hear, and I was hoping from your presentation, because I know how much homework you do, and I respect and appreciate that from you. I was waiting to hear that we have, in your opinion, a significant problem with fugitive lead dust, or with...
Well, I'd be happy to respond to that.
Okay. And if so, I kind of wanted to have that discussion first about how we have a hole in our policy based on the work that you've done before we propose a solution, or some manner of group of folks to be able to come back to us with a potential solution. I like and appreciate that what you've done here is try and put a host of different people together who have diverse perspectives so that it can inform a discussion. But if the end of that process is to adopt regulation, I'm a lot more comfortable with staff guiding this process, and with this being a staff-driven process, and them organizing folks that might be involved to consult with, rather than letting a group of citizens lead the effort and kind of essentially leave staff out, is the way I read this. I'm concerned about that. Certainly they're the ones in charge of the day-to-day work of compliance issues, and so I would certainly want them leading any effort a group of citizens would go through, because in the opposite way that my initial discussion was, we want to make sure we're not adopting regulation that can't be done in the real world. At the same time, we don't want things proposed that can't be done in the regulatory world that staff can't do either. So I'm not sure I can support this motion the way it's written, but I am supportive of having staff put together, folks, and research options should we recognize that we have a significant gap in our current regulations. Is that it? And if you want to speak to the first part about why you think we have a gap, I'd appreciate that.
Well, I thought that I had already explained that.
I apologize. This kind of
That's okay.
It's a work
Well,
session, so
no,
I think we can do this.
Well, absolutely. No, I'll go over it again.
I got from you
And add to
what
it.
the dangers are if there's a problem. I just didn't
Yeah.
hear from you why you think that a problem does exist.
Well, the problem is that the EPA regulations only cover demolition of houses, residences, and children-occupied facilities, schools, daycare, so on. They do not cover demolition of public or commercial buildings, and neither does our code. And lead's not even listed in our code as a hazardous material. So, to me, that's a huge gap. For homes and child-occupied facilities, the EPA, it's a regulation. The abatement or remediation has to be done by a licensed, trained contractor,
I appreciate
which does not pertain to us. So,
I appreciate that. Stuart, could you address that from a staff perspective then? We have, ORAPA isn't doing any manner of work to regulate that out of commercial demolition?
Yeah, the way I would address that is that there are not specific regulations that I'm aware of that are spelling out lead. What they're addressing is the larger category of dust, and so there are rules and regulations for these structures for the fugitive emissions. And within those fugitive emissions, there is not a listing of whether that's lead, whether that's asbestos, whether it is other hazardous materials. So if those dusts are not allowed to go airborne, and those regulations do exist, that's LRAPA's oversight to prevent the dust to become airborne, then it doesn't leave the site. And so there's not a prescriptive list of what all the elements of those dusts could be or may not be.
I'm not sure I understand why you think that with the regulation. I'm sorry, I thought I still had time.
We've got, that was his time that was counting down from to respond to your question.
I asked him a question, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, and
Okay.
I would like another round
Okay.
to
And
finish that.
go to
line of
Claire
thought.
next.
Great. So I meant to ask this in my first round. Can you give us an estimate of the number of demolitions that are conducted in Eugene in an average year?
I can tell you that last year, 2012, we had about 45. That ranges from everything down to just a bit larger than the backyard shed, because I should share as well, anything under a couple hundred square feet we do not regulate, so the true backyard shed will not be on our radar. So the smallest of houses up to the large buildings, about 45 last year. It's actually pretty close to 45 for the last several years. And if we go back to 2006, 2005, 2004, we were maybe closer to 50 and 60 a year.
Great, thanks. So I tend to agree with Councilor Clark on this, that I'm not sure about the urgency of creating a panel. I do think there's enough information before us to ask staff to follow up on their own suggestion of working with other regulatory agencies to look at the gaps, and then perhaps if we were unsatisfied with what was proposed in terms of trying to close that gaps, then maybe going with this more robust proposal that George has out here. But in either case, I would add to look not just at commercial and public buildings, but as structures as well, since Councilor Brown's brought this example of a bridge that was covered in lead, so that might not qualify necessarily as a building. So there might be other structures that we'd want to be looking at. And then I guess specific to your motion, George, what you've outlined here, would that be the only charge of the group? Would it disband once it had issued that report?
yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Good? Okay. I put myself in the queue, and then Chris will be next. Would staff need a motion from council to go forward with Stewart's recommendations to include discussion with LRAPA, EPA staff, city staff, and possibly even somebody in the demolition/construction world to first identify if there is a gap and second, make recommendations?
We would not need a motion for us. Our proposals, that's how we're moving forward. If you choose a different route or would prefer us not to do that, then of course we would take that as guidance. But our intent would be to move forward with this pending some other guidance.
All right, well, I'm more inclined to go along with Councilor Clark also and have staff do its research and work first, and then come back to us with, if there is a gap, this is what we recommend before we take any further action. So I won't be able to support the motion. Chris?
Thank you. It seems to me there's two things we're considering. The first one is there a problem? The second one is, what should we do about it? I think George has, at least for me, done a persuasive job of saying there may be a problem, a gap, something that we need to explore more fully. And so, for me, I do think we need to go a next step. I'm sufficiently persuaded by George's comments to think everything is not just hunky-dory. We need to explore. I think there may be a gap, and we need to look at what that is. So the second question then is, what should we do about it? And we have two possibilities. One is the direction you're proposing to go, which is to get with LRAPA staff, consider some options, bring some things back to us, and make some recommendations for how we could deal with this gap or problem. The other one is to create a committee to essentially do the same thing. I'm thinking, what will we get from the committee that is more than we would get from the process that you're describing? And I'm not really seeing anything on the ground that delivers more or better than what your original proposal was. I think having staff get together with LRAPA, what other experts you need to get together with, to look at an expanded list of possibilities, more than just certain kinds of structures, but any kind of structure, to explore those possibilities, but do it in the process you described, I think will get us to the same outcome, but it will do it in a more efficient and more appropriate way. I think creating a new committee to do work that can be done by an existing group or existing combination of groups it doesn't really get us any further down the road. So the only reason I wouldn't support George's proposal is because I think we'll do the work George wants to do. I'm just saying we can do it in this way with you more appropriately and more effectively.
Alan, do you want to jump in here real quick?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to thank George Brown for bringing this issue in front of us. It's an important health issue. I'd also like to thank him for doing the homework that he did. And I thought Stuart Ramsey did a very good job of explaining what's going on the ground. I tend to agree with what Chris Pryor said, which is that we should identify a gap, if any, and have our staff and experts look at that and bring it back to council, and then go from there. I appreciate what George is trying to do with the committee, but and we might end up there. It might be a good place to go if once we find out what the staff has to say about where we are and what the next steps should be, and that might well be where we have an advisory committee at that point. But I would like to see the next steps as proposed by staff to go forward and get that back to us, and then potentially take up George's motion later.
Thank you. Mike?
Thank you. I just want to say that I don't always vote with George or agree on every issue, certainly, but there's no doubt that when you feel an issue is important, you do your homework and come back with fully thought out solutions. And I just want to say I appreciate what you put forward here. I can see the wisdom of it. Like I said, if I had a clearer sense of the problem and how this is a better solution than the staff bringing us something back. But I want to make sure I'm expressing that when I vote no on it, it isn't out of a lack of respect and appreciation for the work you did to raise the issue. It's an important health issue. I'm just not really clear at the moment about how there's a gap with lead particulate as opposed to standard dust particulate and how it's controlled. But I'm certainly open to further education from my friend.
Betty?
Thank you. I have no doubt that there's a gap and that there should be some regulation. However, I'm not convinced we should have a committee. I think if we don't come up with something, then maybe a committee to help us. But I think that we definitely need, it's a health issue, and that we do need, that there is a gap and that we need to do something. And I assume that if we propose an ordinance, there would be a public hearing, would there not? In which case, people such as George has recommended could come and speak to us, and people could solicit their input even. But generally, I think we have too many committees and commissions. Thank you.
All right, George, we'll give you one more round, and then we'll
Okay.
vote on this.
Thank you. Well, I kind of see where this is going. I feel that my proposal actually is better, and this is not meant as any disrespect to staff whatsoever. It's just, I feel that we at council, and I've researched this a lot, but I'm not an expert, and I feel none of our councilors are an expert, and I respectfully feel that staff is not an expert in this area either, and I think it would be better served to get a group of knowledgeable people together, and then they could consult with everyone. And it looks like my motion will probably not pass, so and I'm not sure how to go about this, but I would like to participate in some of the meetings. I have no idea what the end result will be, what my hypothetical committee would come up with. I have no presuppositions about that. They may come up with a result that I didn't like. That's a possibility. But I just thought involving, knowledgeable people who would then consult other knowledgeable people. I think that's the best way to go. But if this doesn't pass, I would like to be included. I'd like some maybe head nods around the table. We kind of did this. It was a little unusual, but we kind of did this when I brought forward the getting rid of the pesticides in the park. And I went to a meeting with staff and stakeholders with absolutely no presuppositions, no recommendations, no anything. And it was a great meeting. I learned so much. It was really a fantastic meeting, and that would be, my hope for if mine fails and people direct staff to do the whole thing, I'd like to be included somehow. Head nods, maybe possible. I mean, not to be the boss or anything, but just to participate, because I have done a lot of research on this. Thank you.
Betty, real quick.
Certainly, I think George should participate, but I was going to suggest that you go to LRAPA board meetings, have a public comment time. And I was going to suggest that you go there, and since you have done so much work and are so well informed on this, and I assure you they will listen. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, with that, we're ready to vote. All in favor of George's motion, signify. 1. All opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alan?
No.
6. Motion fails. All right, well, moving on to the next item, which is an ordinance concerning downtown and mixed-use development. My understanding, Mr. City Manager, this is to address some of the questions that were brought up at the public hearing Monday night.
It is, and I don't know, Carolyn?
Yes, I sure will. So as you recall, we had a public hearing on these proposed code amendments on Monday evening. There were enough questions from the council that we thought we'd take this opportunity today to provide you with a little bit more information about these proposed code amendments. We will be back to you this coming Monday and can respond to any of your questions that you may have. We don't have a lot of time today, but we'd be happy to respond on Monday and potentially get to action. I'm going to turn it off to Alyssa in a second here, but just a few words about code amendments in general, and that is, in 2001, the land use LUCU was adopted, the Land Use Code Update. So for the last 12 years, we have had a lot of experience administering that code and working through many different situations. We've heard from stakeholders, from neighbors, from business owners, from the development community about things that aren't working with the code. And so what we're committing to is really a series of ongoing code amendments that will work to improve our code really in a continual basis. So we have a very large backlog, I would say, of items that we think need to be addressed in the code. And so we're going to be bringing those to you systematically to kind of improve our code. And so this is really just the beginning. We are starting our code amendments with items that are needed to implement Envision Eugene. So these, the proposed amendments currently address multifamily housing and commercial, but we will be back to you in the fall with code amendments addressing single-family homes and neighborhoods. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Alyssa, who can walk you through what we're trying to achieve with each one of these changes.
Thank you, Carolyn. So again, my name is Alyssa Hansen with the Planning Division, and what I want to do is respond to Councilor Zelenko's question at the end of Monday's public hearing about, the why of these code amendments. So I'm going to go through the first 7 topics, not touch the last topic because it's really just a reorganization, a housekeeping, and there's no actual changes to the regulations. So, and you should have before you a packet of maps, and I'm going to try to use these maps to be able to point to you where these specific regulations apply. So starting with the first topic, which is housing and commercial. So one of the strategies in Envision Eugene is to transform our downtown, our key transit corridors, and our core commercial areas into mixed-use neighborhoods. And during Envision Eugene, our thoughts about what is mixed use have really evolved. Our code was established really on that mixed use has to be vertical. With you have ground floor commercial or office, and then you would have housing above that. But during Envision Eugene, we've kind of branched out from that and realized that we can also have horizontal mixed use. So we can have residential in one building next to a commercial building. And the 2 code amendments that fall under this topic of housing and commercial are really to allow those types of mixed use. So the first would allow, well, let me just back up. So you have this first map is the map of, shows the zoning within the downtown plan area. The downtown plan boundary is the dark outline. The core of downtown is, that red color, and that's C3, that's major commercial. Within downtown, we already allow housing on the ground floor. We already allow this horizontal type of mixed use. In the lighter pink area, which is our C2 or community commercial, we also allow that horizontal mixed use, and that was changed actually in 2008. So prior to 2008, in those pink areas, it had to be vertical mixed use. One example of an apartment complex downtown that is strictly residential would be the Park Place Apartments just south of Full City. That was a building that was redeveloped. It was formerly an office building, actually had city offices in it, and it is now fully an apartment building. So that's the kind of development we're looking to see. This proposal would, what we're proposing is to expand that allowance for commercial or residential on the ground floor to all the areas shown on the second map. So these are all the areas within the city that are zone C2, community commercial, and the proposal here is to allow that flexibility on the ground floor to also allow for housing. Let's see, in terms of, we've heard that, requiring the ground floor commercial, it really increases the complexity and the cost of development. It can be a hindrance to even those types of buildings being developed. We've also heard from affordable housing providers that this would be a benefit to some of the projects that they've been thinking about doing. The second proposal under this topic of housing in commercial zones only applies within downtown within the C3 zone. So once again, that red area. And it's really just about expanding housing options for downtown. It would allow, so mixed use, or pure multifamily is allowed, so 3 or more apartment units you can do anywhere within the downtown. Within that red area, you couldn't do 1 or 2 apartments. You'd have to do 3 or more. And we have had inquiries from everywhere from, a large building who was potentially looking at just putting an apartment on 1 floor to a small 2-story building where the owner of that retail establishment actually wanted to create an apartment for somebody to work in. And this would allow for that type of housing. We're not expecting to see a lot of that, but it would just give that flexibility in terms of redevelopment. So the next topic is surface parking limitation in the C3 zone. So once again, it's that red area within the downtown plan boundary. And then you can see off in the far right corner there on 13th and Alder, there's a couple of properties, including the U of O bookstore and then the property right across 13th from that. Those are also happen to be zone C3. So the surface parking limitation applies to all C3 properties. And it was established as part of the land use code update to discourage surface parking lots. So I know on its face, with us tinkering with that, it seems really counter to some of our goals of Envision Eugene, which is, increasing density and redevelopment in these core commercial areas. But this is another place where our thoughts and understanding of development and redevelopment have evolved. The standard right now would require that, or only allow a surface parking lot of 20 spaces, which doesn't seem so bad, except for what we're seeing is that, and I think the Lane Community College is a good example. We're seeing maybe some lower value buildings taken down, and in the interim, those properties are used for parking until the market conditions are right, or until the right developer comes along to redevelop those properties. And that's not the only example I think we can think of downtown where that's kind of it's worked as a land banking site. And so this particular code amendment would don't use that term, would adjust those regulations and allow for up to 40 spaces if it could be accessed via an alley, and then also not require that there be a building on that site. And I will say, in terms of what we've heard from the stakeholders on this topic has been coming up since the downtown plan was adopted in 2004. So this changes to this particular code section have been discussed since then, and we've heard a spectrum of comments from eliminate the entire standard to leave it as it stands. And so we feel like what's being proposed really strikes a balance there. It allows some more parking, but it doesn't open it up to all parking. The next topic are large commercial facility standards. These are also something that was adopted as part of the land use code update. They apply to new commercial buildings in the commercial zone that are 25,000 square feet or greater. The intent of these standards, makes sense for downtown. They regulate the appearance and function of commercial developments, and I think we'd all agree that that's a good thing. However, a number of the standards are really geared more towards those sites you might see on the edges of town, larger, greenfield sites, so to say. Whereas downtown, we already have a gridded street pattern. We have sidewalks. We've got alleys. There's parking exempt areas. A lot of the buildings have 0 setbacks. They are common wall construction, which is very different from, for instance, the new Lowe's that was built out West 11th. So what's been happening is there's been a couple of developments, including Lane Community College, the downtown campus, and the Woolworth and the Bennett project. Both of those had to request to go through our adjustment review process, which is a land use application, in order to seek relief from some of these standards that just don't make sense downtown. One of those standards would have required each of those buildings where they have a customer entrance to, in addition to the standard sidewalk that we already provide as a city, they would have had to have another 8-foot wide sidewalk and another 6 feet of landscaping. So that would have been, they would have had to been set back an additional 14 feet, which we don't think makes sense in the city core. Really, essentially what we're saying is that we would like to exempt the downtown properties from about 5 of the standards under this subheading of large commercial facilities. The building articulation, the window requirements would all continue to apply. But those that would end up with the kind of development we don't want to see downtown, we'd like to have an exemption there. Moving on to the commercial landscaping standards, if you can come back to the downtown zoning map. So just in the red area, those properties are not required to provide on-site landscaping. But you'll notice that there is landscaping downtown nonetheless. The city provides it in medians, in planters, there's some in the alleys, and there are property owners who do provide it. Once again, the Bennett or Woolworth building along the alley has some landscaping. Lane Community College provided landscaping. Our library provided landscaping. So there are a number of examples where that's provided, even though it's not required. Once you get outside of that red or C3 area, within the lighter pink area, those properties are required to provide 10% of their site in landscaping, regardless if they're in the downtown plan area or not. So the proposal here is for those C2 properties within the downtown plan area to have them provide 5% of their site in landscaping. So you have a transition from no requirements to 5%, and then beyond that it would retain the 10% of the site. There's a second component to the landscaping standards, and right now the code has a requirement. Well, it's actually, so no one is, technically, most properties are not, commercial properties aren't required to provide landscaping between the building and the street, with the exception of the standards I mentioned previously. If they do provide landscaping between the building and the street, it has to be a minimum of 7 feet. So that's it. And it has to provide, they have to provide at least, there's landscaping standards, and they have to provide at least 1 tree. So once again, that is kind of a disincentive for people downtown who maybe want to put in, if you think of once again of LCC, they have a smaller bed. In order to do that, you would have to go through a special process just to provide a 2, 3, 4 foot wide landscaping bed downtown. So we're actually proposing to remove this entire width requirement, and that would honestly apply citywide to remove that requirement. Moving on to the Nodal Development Overlay Zone, that is your third map, and that shows the areas within the city that are that have the Nodal Development Overlay Zone applied to them. The one off Coburg, the Crescent Village site, the Lower River Road site, and the site over off Royal, those all of the properties that are inside the city limits have that ND or Nodal Development Overlay. Within downtown, only about 5 properties have it. And as we discussed on Monday night, our Nodal development policies and program come out of our trans plan. So, until we replace them, we do have this Nodal development zone. And its intent is, the stated intent is to encourage mixed-use development. However, it has a one-size-fits-all nature, and in some cases can really be prohibitive to the kind of development we want to see. It has, when you look at that code, here's a list of prohibited uses. You can't do this, you can't do this, you have to be set back this way, you can't have this type of use. Whereas, a property across the street who wouldn't have the ND overlay, might be the same zoning, wouldn't have those types of limitations and therefore may be more attractive to develop. So we're trying to just, nudge these properties along. These are areas where we want to see mixed-use development, and there's been some areas that have just been recognized as limiting or restricting the development. So one of those is allowing that all properties with that Nodal development overlay be allowed to seek an adjustment review. Right now, that's limited to certain properties. We're also clarifying the requirements for parking between buildings and streets, just for corner lots, because it was pretty restrictive if there was a lot on a corner, where they could provide their parking. And then finally, we're adding more relevant adjustment review criteria. If we're kind of, allowing more properties to do an adjustment review, we want to make sure that we're still getting the type of development we want to see, because right now the adjustment review criteria is very vague. Similarly, for the transit-oriented development overlay zone, which is your last map, it's the red hashed area. We're mirroring that has been in effect since probably the mid to late 90s. Within that area, and as it turns out, we mirrored some of the language when we wrote the Nodal Development Overlay Zone. We copied some of the language from the Transit-Oriented Development Overlay Zone, and so we're mirroring some of the changes from the ND zone to the TD zone. And then finally, the traffic impact analysis level of service changes within downtown. So the proposal here would be to eliminate the requirement for a traffic impact analysis, which is a land use application within the boundaries of the downtown plan area, minus those that are part of the EWEB master plan. And then there's a concurrent level of service reduction, or allowed level of service reduction for that same area. And we've worked really closely with Public Works on this. This is something that came up a lot during the Envision Eugene public process in 2010 and 2011. Could we do this for downtown? Could we do this, along our key transit corridors and our core commercial areas? And so we're starting with downtown because it has some really unique characteristics when compared to the rest of the city. You think about the gridded street pattern that we already have. It's built out. We have sidewalks everywhere downtown. There's multiple ways to reach destinations. There's not just one way in or one way out. There's, multiple streets. Downtown already has a lower adopted mobility standard or level of service as compared to the rest of downtown, meaning that we accept more congestion downtown. And as a result, we have lower speeds, which also makes it, a more comfortable environment for walking. Downtown has ample transit facilities, and we also have a priority on alternative modes. Also, downtown is primarily redevelopment, and it's also, as I mentioned before, zero setbacks typically. Properties are up to the right-of-way, which means, we're probably not going to be adding any lanes downtown. We're probably not going to be widening the streets downtown. We also have recently adopted access management standards, which control our driveway locations, so we don't need a TIA to do that. And then, within a large part of downtown, projects don't have to provide on-site parking. So then that actually eliminates driveways, and we have, there's a lot of the alleys are used for parking, behind buildings, and we have a lot of parking garages. So it was for these reasons that it was determined that really a TIA is an unnecessary tool for downtown. And I can give you two recent examples of projects that went through this traffic impact analysis, and as a result, they were not required to do any mitigation. There was nothing that they had to do to any of the streets. I need some water.
Take a break.
I'm trying to talk really fast to get through this all in our half hour. So the two projects, and I think you'll be familiar with both of them. First is the Northwest Community Credit Union down there by the federal courthouse. That was a 70,000 square foot building. And as a result of that, of all the intersections that were analyzed for that, only one is projected to drop in level of service, and that's so level of service goes from A, which would really be essentially no congestion, to F, level of service F, which would be the most congested you'd see. And there was one intersection from all the traffic that would drop from an LOS B to C, so it meets our standards. The Capstone project, I think you're familiar with, 232 units approximately there on Olive, and that, as a result of that, no mitigation was required. There were no streets that were proposed to drop in terms of level of service. So in either case, these projects were required to go through these land use application processes, hire consultants, and as a result, we did not require anything. And, downtown, even just talking with our Public Works, they're not sure what what it is we would require. If we're not going to require, expanded streets, so it's really about capacity of vehicles, and we're not going to expand our streets downtown. We're not going to add additional lanes. It's really an unnecessary application. So that's all I have. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Well done. I'm very interested in the waiving of the TIA. Is that something we can decide and the council can just adopt, and then it's perfectly legal and it's not going to meet any state challenge that a TIA would just not be required in this particular area?
So a TIA is really a local tool. It's not something that the state requires that we have. It's something that we chose. We do have other, transportation planning rule
Be able to prove
that we have
rules.
to meet, and so we have findings. We've consulted with the city attorneys, and
This has always been a double standard issue for me when it comes to Envision Eugene stuff, where we talk about phantom inventory, where we say this is where we want to grow more densely, but then we have these other rules in place that limit it from actually getting built and actually taking place. So I'm hopeful that perhaps we waive TIA in some other places, but that's just me talking hopefully, when it comes to actually fulfilling the goals we've put out in Envision Eugene and specifically around residential. Do we have the capacity to do that with residential? To waive TIA in a place where we know that we want to build more densely?
I think the issue there is that in downtown, as Alyssa said, we have a built-out street network. In other areas, like along our transit corridors, where we've also said that we want additional density, there actually may be mitigation measures that we would require, whether it be a new signal or an expanded lane or something like that. Downtown is unique in that we have all the stoplights that we need. We have the right amount of lanes, and we're not going to be expanding lanes downtown. So that's the only issue. I think what we would do is, if there was
I apologize for interrupting. It's really about our ability to impose the costs for changing the environment that we want to transpose to those who build it. Yes?
It is a tool that we have in order to make sure that our infrastructure meets the needs of the density.
That we have somebody else pay for it when they build additional capacity, right?
They're paying for their impact.
Okay. This is going to be a weird and tough question. Why did nodal development work in Crescent Village when it didn't where we wanted it?
one of the things about Crescent Village is that there was a large property and a very motivated owner. Yeah, single owner has made a big difference in that property, and they had a vision, and they were very enthusiastic about that type of development. In a lot of the other places, Lower River Road, that, I don't know how many property owners there are, but there are quite a few. And so, they haven't come together.
But this particular property owner assembled that set of properties before he did the work. Wouldn't that be required anywhere someone was going to do a nodal development, more or less?
Not necessarily. It could be implemented one property at a time.
Yeah.
It is more challenging that way.
So you think that's the big hurdle?
Well,
why
and
we
it was
haven't seen
vacant.
happen?
It was
I
also
asked I apologize. I asked because we're going to have the transplant stuff next at some
right.
point. So why didn't it work?
That's and I think that's a whole nother work session.
Okay. All right. And I just want to make sure that when we get to that point that we're looking at Crescent and saying what worked here and didn't work there. Why did we not get it? Last, when I look at some of the stuff where C2s jump back and forth outside the downtown plan boundaries, are any of those C2 properties at a disadvantage for being outside the downtown plan boundary for some manner of incentive or some manner of appropriate development participation that those within the boundary are eligible for? And if so, is it a huge pain to be able to alter that boundary if we saw fit to do so in order to assist in that process?
So the boundary is established as part of the Eugene Downtown Plan, which is a refinement plan for this area. So it would take a refinement plan amendment in order to do that. Right now, the difference is, if you have C2 inside, if you're within the downtown plan boundary, you can have residential on the ground floor, and outside you cannot. That's one of the things that we're proposing to change.
So that outside, that's one of the changes to be able to make those C2s outside the plan boundary a little more contemporary with.
Right.
Are there other things that we should be changing that are not proposed here?
One other round after the answer.
Good question.
9 o'clock. No, actually, that was my last question. So
I don't have an answer to that question.
you don't have an answer?
No.
Are there differences? Significant?
I think right close to the boundary, probably not. I mean, it reminds me of a school boundary, though. It's like you have to draw it somewhere, and it's something worth looking at, though, in the future and exploring.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Claire?
Yep, thanks. So I had a couple of questions, then a couple of suggestions. So with the TIA, then, it seems like it's really only a relevant tool when we expect there might be some kind of mitigation that would need to happen in order to accommodate the new activity around that new development.
Correct.
Okay. And then on the parking, this may sound like a really silly question, but what is it meant by standalone parking?
A parking lot without a building.
And so would these changes then allow a developer to develop a parking lot in downtown?
Yes, it would be limited in the number of spaces.
40?
To 40 if they were taking access via the alley.
And then assuming that we're going to have, more waves of this kind of thing coming before us, kind of building on what the mayor had said the other night, I think one way, and you did some of this right now in this presentation, to kind of help us conceptualize these is to really provide examples of some things that would be solved by the changes. So some of the challenges that people have had in trying to propose developments that came up against these regulations that we may then trying to adjust in order to accommodate what we're trying to achieve. And also, though, I think like with this question of the TIA or the parking, knowing what the rationale was for the code when it was first implemented, if that's known, would also be very valuable to have some perspective on how we're moving things around. So we know where we've been and why we were there and where we're trying to get to. Thanks.
Betty?
Thank you. I have to respond to Mike's thing about boundaries. There's always a boundary. Sometimes it rains in my backyard and not in my front yard. Anyway, I
Love to hear
was
the story on that one sometime, Betty.
I was here when we adopted all the land use code updates, and actually I remember being in this room. For some reason we had to meet over here on a night and we had to get out by 10 because we were used to going later back then, and when we needed to, and we were just rushing through one after the other. And I think there are some changes needed, but I hope we don't rush through them and do too much at once. I do think that we need a just to comment on a few things. I think traffic impact analysis is very important, regardless of where it is, and maybe those two things that got the waiver shouldn't have happened. I think it's a good idea to allow housing on the first floor. At the time we were doing it, I thought, why wouldn't we? And we were pushing for commercial on the first floor of everything, when at the same time that we had commercial spaces empty. And you can have too much more commercial than you need. So I think that will be a good change if we make it. The parking lot's 40 spaces. I don't think that's a good idea. And mainly I think that we should think, as Claire said, what was the reason in the first place, if there was a good reason, before we change something, and what are the possible unforeseen, unwanted consequences of any change we make. And let's not do so much as much as we did before. There was a lot of thought put into the updates by a lot of people, but then when we came to adopting all those things, we just did it bang, 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 and it was too fast. Thank you.
Chris?
Thanks. I remember working on TransPlan back in the first iteration and having some questions about the concept of nodal development because it operated on certain social, cultural, and work assumptions. And some of them played out, and some of them absolutely didn't play out. And so sometimes you got lucky with an area, but I do think the points about single ownership being able to assemble some of those assumptions in a way that they could control worked well. It was kind of a crapshoot in terms of whether it's going to work or not. But I think what it turned into was much smarter and more effective. It made more of a realistic assumption about what people actually do versus what we wished they would do. To to the code amendments, I think the notion of not trying to create one-size-fits-all is a good one, because I think that kind of one-size-fits-all is what pushed all that development on West 11th right up to the line, which is creating problems now. And so being smart about where you're doing it and what you're doing it and providing some flexibility, I do think is a good thing. What you don't want to do is err too far the other direction in creating you can have whatever you want. So I think moving very gradually and incrementally to try to accommodate flexibility without looking like you're being arbitrary or capricious or just, throwing everything open is a wise way to go. So I appreciate you're doing this in kind of an incremental way. I think what you're proposing right now, at least on the surface of it, look reasonable. I mean, as Laura Potter said, it's a start. You're not probably as far as they would like you to go, but I do think the pace at which we're going is probably a good one. So I appreciate your attempt to be flexible, but not trying to go too fast or throw things open too broadly.
Okay, we're right at 1:30, and I saw George's hand go up. I haven't checked in with Alan, so if you want to extend the meeting, I'll need a motion.
I'll extend to move 5 minutes.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? All opposed? Alan?
Aye.
Okay, George and then Alan.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I was thinking about this increasing, parking spaces from 20 to 40. That would be for what? Is that like where there's a small building, perhaps the owner wants to knock it down and have a parking lot
Exactly.
until it gets redeveloped, or?
That's really our thought, is that, as we've seen downtown, that's kind of been the evolution of redevelopment. There might be a low-value building, maybe it's even set back too far from the street compared to what we like to see downtown. The developer may want to, or the property owner maybe wants to remove that building, and in the interim, until it is redeveloped, use that site for parking. And that's what we're trying to encourage. It's really a transition. We don't want to see a proliferation of parking lots downtown. That's not the intent of this. The intent is to allow for that redevelopment to happen gradually.
That's pretty much about the lowest value you can use certain lots for. I mean, there's certain areas where I think it's appropriate. So have you heard of any projects in the works that would immediately happen via the grapevine or anything? I can think of several sites already where this could happen.
I think there's a couple downtown that, we've heard through the grapevine that's a potential.
Okay.
But I don't know if
I see.
I don't have specifics on those.
All right, and then the one of the essential components is it has to have alley access too,
Correct.
right?
Yes, so that's
That
correct.
kind of nails down certain sites more than others.
And just really quickly, the intent, if you think about the U.S. Bank parking lot, it is only, that's a large lot, and that's well more than 40, I believe. I believe the Kiva lot's only slightly more than 20.
Or 30.
30, okay,
Yeah.
so that, for reference, that helps you out. But the U.S. Bank parking lot, you can only access that via the alley, and then that, the rest of it is landscaped, and that helps, with the pedestrian environment, so you're not trying to dodge, different driveways.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I don't have any questions at this time.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.